abbiamo l'onore di ospitare il professor Michael Woolcock, uno scienziato sociale che ci illustrerà il ruolo sociale e istituzionale delle istituzioni che si occupano, delle organizzazioni che si occupano di lotta alla povertà, di come queste organizzazioni agiscono nei vari territori, quali sono gli elementi che possono facilitare dei programmi di sviluppo nei vari contesti e per l'appunto come si può costruire quella fiducia di cui abbiamo già parlato nei precedenti incontri. Michael Woolcock è un senior advisor alla Banca Mondiale e siamo onorati di averlo qui questa sera. Vi ricordiamo che domani c'è l'ultimo appuntamento di tesi.
Thank you very much. My natural inclination is to speak very quickly, so I'm going to have one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake at the same time. So I hope, for the translator's sake, as much as for your sake, that I can be sufficiently restrained and accurately convey, nonetheless, both the content and the excitement that I think accompanies a lot of this work. Tonight we will have a chance to try and spell these out in a bit more detail. Before I start on that, though, I just want to give you a bit of a sense of who I am and what I do. As you heard during the introduction, I work in the Development Research Group, which is part of the World Bank. I have done so for the last 12 years or so, but with periods of leave away from there to go and do other things. I am the only sociologist in the research department of the World Bank out of about 100 A-list economists. So I am a statistically insignificant minority, but nonetheless. I do what I do, and I have learnt a lot from working with some of the best microeconomists around on these issues. I also did quite a bit of economics as part of my graduate training, so I wouldn't have got the job I have if I was completely ignorant on questions pertaining to economics. But I attained my position in the research department in part because of the early work that I had done around this idea of social capital, which was an idea that at the time was enjoying quite a large and high profile within the operational people at the bank, the people that lend money to countries and try and do things in the world. And my job in part was to try and sort of provide some analytical structure and some empirical flesh, if you will, on some of these ideas. It was also my privilege when I first joined the bank to be involved right from the beginning with the world's largest social capital project, the largest attempt to try and embody the theory behind social capital in an actual development project. So the first part of my presentation tonight is going to talk about the theory and the measurement of social capital. The last part is going to talk about more practically how I've engaged with this particular project and various different clones, various different attempts to replicate this kind of project elsewhere in the world. So if I do my job, I will sort of try and speak between the sort of the theory and the 30,000-foot view, as we sometimes say, the view you see from looking out the aeroplane window versus the view from trying to actually make this work in actual countries that are facing actual problems. So that's the broad overview of where we're going to go. I've also, though, just come back from 2.5 years at the University of Manchester. Because I'm this weird sociology guy with all these economists, they periodically allow me to hang out with my own kind, to sort of go back, lest I become a sort of bad economist. By osmosis, they let me go into back to academia to do different things. And for 3.5 years, I was involved with helping to set up the Brooks World Poverty Institute at the University of Manchester. So I finished that at Christmas time, and I rejoined the World Bank in January to pick up where I left off. Okay, so I've given you some sense of where we're going to go, but just let me provide just a bit more detail. I'm going to start off with this big picture view of what I think development ultimately entails. And I'll talk about a fourfold transformation that I think is one of the defining features of development. And then look at the specific ways in which this plays out in the social dimensions of development. From there, I will use a social capital perspective to interpret some of these issues, as well as provide a brief sense of some of the problems and the issues that surround the use of language like social capital, because it's a very contested field in many respects. And then, as I said in the third section, I will talk about the applications to three specific areas within development policy: understanding the survival and mobility strategies of poor people, looking at how formal and informal institutions engage with one another, and sort of broader the challenge of enhancing the inclusiveness, the opportunities, and the accountability that poor people are able to bring to bear in their engagements with the rest of society. Most of my current work is actually on local level justice systems. I am involved in a large multi-country study called Justice for the Poor, which started in Indonesia on the kind of research that I will talk about later on. Now works also in Cambodia and in several countries in the South Pacific. And here we are trying to look at how justice systems, the ways in which local level village chiefs, the ways in which customary legal systems, in particular over land, how they manage land, how those interact with formal institutions, particularly around property rights and other kinds of issues. But that's sort of what I'm working on now. All that I'm going to talk about today is sort of the work that sort of provided some of the foundations for my thinking and my research around this. Okay, so I said that when we think about development, we can think about it as a fourfold transformation, and I just want to speak to each of those four fairly quickly, but then obviously focus on the social components down here. So when we say, for example, that Italy is a more developed country than Congo, for example, or my country, Australia, is more developed than Papua New Guinea, or some other country like that, what do we actually mean? Well, I think, at least in terms of how international development agencies think about this, it's implicitly, if not explicitly, about trying to think about this transition in four different dimensions. When we talk about modern economic growth, for example, economists who know their economic history will recognize that phrase from Simon Kuznets, right? And Simon Kuznets wrote about modern economic growth and argued essentially that you got a modern economy by enhancing productivity. So when we look at Saudi Arabia, for example, and we look at the Czech Republic, those countries have roughly comparable levels of per capita income. But we would say that the Czech Republic is more modern than Saudi Arabia because its growth is a function not of exporting oil or natural resources, but of manufacturing, of having people be producing things, right? So a modern economy, as opposed to a non-modern economy, is one that enhances individual level productivity. That is the essence of a modern economy. When we talk about a modern polity, right, in the realms of citizenship, what we are essentially arguing is that the prevailing political structures of society more or less reflect the preferences of the citizens. Right? Now, in countries like Iran and Thailand right now, right, we see a lot of conflict precisely because of the kinds of transition that they're going through. Right? You get revolution, you get protest when the prevailing political system does not, in fact, match the desires of the population as a whole. Now, some people might want to say that this is sort of progress towards democracy, maybe, right? But you can have modern non-democratic countries too, like Singapore, for example, where you could argue, nonetheless, that the political system in place simply reflects the preferences of the people, right? And those preferences can be whatever they are. Okay? So that's a modern economy, that's a political system, that's a modern economy. What we also mean when we talk about a modern society is that it is managed or administered in ways that reflect the rational, bureaucratic, or meritocratic structures of those systems. So people are not hired on the basis of their family connections, on the basis of their being part of a particular ethnic group. Right? You like to think in this university and all the other parts of the Italian society that you are hired on the basis of your talent, right? And that you are promoted and assessed in similar kinds of ways. That is what a modern administrative structure does. Right? And again, to caricature in some sense, a non-modern or pre-modern administrative structure is one where you are not assessed on your talent, you are assessed on your gender, you are assessed on your sexual orientation, you are assessed on some other thing over which you have really no control. So building modern administrative systems is actually one of those sort of seemingly very boring tasks, but is actually really crucial for many of the things that we care about in development, for providing modern schooling, modern hospital systems, modern driver's licensing, modern getting access to passports. All of those things that make modern life possible are ultimately dependent on some sort of rational administrative apparatus that underpins all of that. The fourth and final section is that when we talk about modernization and development is as having a modern society. And in a modern society, there are equal rights and opportunities available to all. Now, this is a constant ambition, very rarely actually achieved. But in principle, that's what when we talk about modernizing a society, or when a society becomes more modern, we talk about full realization of human rights, the full equality of individuals. So in the United States, this was first articulated in its Declaration of Independence, where it was stated in very pioneering language. We take it as self-evident that all men, in this case, are created equal, right? That it was a self-evident truth that people are equal. It's a very modern statement, right? Of people who ascribe to that are modern people. Now, all of these different transitions can occur at different times in different ways and can be often working at different paces, different trajectories. So when we look at countries that are in the midst of great tension at the moment, as we speak, Thailand and Iran, for example, we see these countries in the throes of their own transitions or encounters with modernization. Right? Modern in the sense of people having articulated a belief that they as citizens, they as members of this particular society are not having adequate economic opportunities, are not having the political structures in their society reflect their own individual collective preferences, that the systems that preside over their lives are corrupted and highly inefficient, and that equal rights and opportunities are not available to everyone. They're involved to an elite. They're involved to the people that are members of the right social groups or the members of the right clubs or the right religions. So that's the big picture view of what development has entailed. Most rich countries, when they went through that process, A, took a long time to do it, often centuries, and B, went through that process with lots of conflict and war accompanying it. Right? And so most of the transitions that occur in these 4 different dimensions are very contentious ones. In development, though, we tend to see these as technical problems. We don't discuss the difficulties and the conflicts and the politics of these transitions. We just talk about getting rid of corruption, promoting democracy, enhancing economic growth, or perhaps promoting human rights. Right? There is a discourse, a language that we can appropriate for all of these things, but we have a very weak theory and a very weak understanding of history that often makes us unaware, or at least makes us conspicuously unable to address a lot of the very deep contentions that go necessarily with moving any of these different kinds of dimensions. Okay, so this is the big picture view. Now I'm going to try and scale it down a little bit and talk about the specific transformations of the social relations, because this is how we're going to get ourselves into a discussion of social capital. Again, one of the defining features of being a modern person in the 21st century, as the great Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor articulated it many years ago, is that we begin to have more but very separate sources of what he called the sources of the self, but more in particular aspects of our identity. So we have identities as an employee. We have identities as a member of a particular profession, economists, for example, or academics. We may have particular religious beliefs, or again, in the modern sense, none at all. We have particular roles that we play as members of a family, either as a father, a mother, a spouse, a granddaughter, parent, child. We are members of particular ethnic groups, and we come from particular regions. Right? You can continue that whole process on. All right? But what modernity does is make each of these different kinds of aspects of your identity become salient, politically salient, under particular conditions. Right? And more particularly, it requires that we can move between all of these different identities quite seamlessly, quite unproblematically. Right? So you can be an economist working in academia, who's Catholic, who's married, who is a member of a particular ethnic group from the northern part of Italy, and all of that can be, that particular combination of factors can be taken on or off, or made higher or lower, depending on the circumstances in which you find yourself. Right? So one of the points of this particular system, this particular diagram, was to show not just that there is modernization across these different dimensions, but they become separate. Right? They become separate. And you are asked to assume a different role as a worker, as a citizen, as an employee, as a consumer, and as a member of society. Right? That's what it means to be modern, is that you have all of these different roles that you can, like masks in the theatre, that you can take on and take off. Right? And a large part of what we encounter in development is situations where people are still members of communities that are very much at the center of these kinds of these 4 different worlds, and they're not separate. Right? Now, in your own country, sociologist Edward Banfield made a big deal out of this in his study from a long time ago on when he talked about amoral familism, and then the man called Italy indeed a backward society because of people's fierce attachments to their families, which was more important than anything else, right? Who my family was, my loyalty to my family was everything. That was the most important thing, right? And in many developing countries, that kind of loyalty is still the most important loyalty. Now, when Western eyes or outsiders see a lot of this, they see corruption. They see people taking money from the public purse and using it for their own private gain. But for many people in these situations, yes, perhaps there are instances of corruption, but also this is not corruption for some people because it's just them upholding the claims that particular other social groups can make on them. Right? They have not made that transition to a more modern sensibility where we have these big, deep separations. Okay, so we also then have different, not only different sources of ourselves, we have different roles that we play, but we have different sources of authority as well. Right? In a typical developing country village, authority rests with one person, right? Political authority, religious authority, and other forms of social authority all reside in one person, right? But what do we do in our modern systems is that we separate these, at least in the United States, but in most other OECD countries, we talk about the separation of church and state. We talk about the separation of powers. In the United States, again, we have the judiciary, the courts, and the elected representatives, and the president, as being separate forms of authority, and we keep them separate, right? Having separate approaches to power and having these sources of power act to be countervailing sources of power, power that sort of helps to balance the others out, right? Is what, again, it defines a modern society. You've created very powerful new sources of authority, but they exist in some sense to balance one another out. So we have not just courts and not just states, we also have science itself as yet another source of authority. So when we are explaining why we are sick and why we are ill, right, modern people will defer to a scientific mode of analysis to explain that. We will not say our ancestors are angry with us. We will not say the earth gods are punishing us for being unfaithful, right? But if you are an agricultural worker in many African countries, or if you are a health official in many of these countries, you are trying to deal with perceptions of why the rain hasn't come, or perceptions of why they have contracted AIDS, right, that aren't based on science. They're based on some other cosmological understanding, some other broader system of authority that helps to explain the world, right? The whole notion of evolution, the whole notion that when we look at the beautiful mountains around here, we can see that at one stage they were under the ocean and that tectonic forces have moved over time to push them up, all right? We think that way because we have very modern understandings of how the world came to be the way it is, right? But many people in a developing country context don't see the world as having evolved in that kind of way. Right? So that's what it means to be modern. Now, I should add very quickly on this point that there is mostly, I guess, an assumption that a modern world is the desired objective. But we all know from novelists and from the 20th century itself that our encounters with modernity for rich countries have been fraught with problems. We fought 2 world wars and countless other civil wars as a result of our own transitions through that space that I articulated on the previous slide. So it's deeply problematic, and it still is problematic even for us in the first world today, in the OECD countries today. So we are all still engaging with the ongoing process of figuring out what it means to be modern people. Okay, so what I want to do here is just quickly move on, but I want to just include a quote here from the great Charles Tilly, who was one of the great sociologists of the late 20th century. But looking at one of his definitions of what citizenship is, and I think it encapsulates much of what I've been talking about. He argued that citizenship consists of mutual rights and obligations being defined chiefly or even exclusively by relations to the government rather than by reference to particular connections with rulers or to membership in categories based on imputed durable traits such as race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. It institutionalizes regular categorical relations between subjects and their governments. Okay? Now, that's, again, sort of a big picture quote, but it's the essence of what we, the development people, the challenge that we are engaged in, trying to forge, ultimately, that compact between citizen and state that it does, indeed, confer rights and responsibilities and obligations in both directions. And having the capacity for the state to be able to engage with its people, with its citizens as citizens and not as members of particular durable categorical groups is probably the main big development challenge that we actually face. Okay. Now, because all of these transitions are so fraught with conflict, the one variable that concerns us here today, and the one that I think is so central to how well we manage these very complicated transitions, is this notion of social cohesion, the extent to which societies are able to work together during these particular periods. And in a paper I did a few years ago with Bill Easterly and some other people, we tried to formalize this into a large quantitative study. But the point we were trying to make with that study was that these big wholesale transformations are occurring in society, and as all of us make this transition to and encounter this thing called modernity, or modernization. And the social component of that is key to ensuring that that transformational process occurs in as smooth and as non-violent a way as possible. Now, I'm laying all of this out because when we get to the study of Indonesia, we will see all of those transformations occurring simultaneously. And the challenge that we face as development professionals when a country rapidly, in the case of Indonesia, experiences an economic crisis that kicks a government out of power and replaces it with a new one almost overnight, is that transformation occurs very rapidly with all of the massive potential for conflict. And the fact that Indonesia has not erupted into massive conflict, I think, is an interesting issue to explain, but I think it has something to do with these questions pertaining to social cohesion, in particular, how the relationship between citizens and the state has been able to be reimagined and implemented over the last dozen years or so. But we'll get to that shortly. So that's the big picture view. From a more applied sort of policy point of view, when you're trying to engage in countries like Afghanistan or in other parts of the world where these issues are incredibly complicated, there are three things that I'll just go through quickly here that I think are central to, first of all, doing serious analysis and advising when you are brought in as part of a team of nominal experts to try and advise a country on some of these issues, but also for making policies and projects actually work, right? Not just designing them, but making them actually implementable and working for the benefit of the people they are designed to serve, there are three things that are often underappreciated, but are nonetheless central to making these things happen. The first one is perhaps sounds obvious, and one that we give lots of lip service to in development, but in reality, oftentimes we do not. And that is the importance of understanding the local context. What that means is not just reading a couple of books on the airplane on the way to this country you've never been to before, but understanding more deeply how people's incentives, expectations, preferences, and aspirations are formed. Right? I'll go through those again. How their incentives, their expectations, preferences, and aspirations are formed, and how they are changing. Right? That is, in statistical terms, something that's unobservable. Right? It's hard to get details on those things just by looking at surveys, looking at census material, looking at all the other big sources of data that we might otherwise want to have to help us make better decisions. The details of understanding how each of those things comes together requires extensive time in the field and working with local people and local languages, local anthropologists, indeed, to figure out how those things are formed and how they evolve. Not only do we need to do that, we need to understand how what types of strategies, poor people in particular, and elites more generally, what types of strategies they invoke to realize those things. Okay? So at one level, there's lots of similarity across the world on these things, but the details matter in each of these countries. How exactly poor people negotiate their way around the local leadership structures, how they deal with and internalize often brutal oppression that's forced upon them. All of this requires detailed understanding if you're then going to try and embark on these ambitious tasks of trying to transform societies, economies, polities, and bureaucratic administration. So, context in general. The second aspects where I think the social dimensions can be really crucial are in understanding processes of implementation. What do I mean by that? Most of the intellectual energy in development goes to those people who sit around and design this thing called a policy or a project, right? Much less effort is given to the more boring and routine tasks of actually implementing things on a day-to-day basis. That's the first point. But as a corollary to that, many of the challenges associated with implementation itself entail social interaction. Okay? If you are if you're having a policy around enhancing education, for example, what you really are saying is that we need children between the ages of 6 and perhaps 15 years old to go to school for 6 hours a day for 200 days a year, probably for 10 years of their life, right? Do the mathematics on that, and you're up to tens of thousands of hours of a teacher interacting with a student, okay? Now, we also know from research on education and health that in countries like India and Bangladesh, for example, sometimes on any given day, 70% of teachers are not even showing up for work. Right? So the problem isn't with the policy. Everybody agrees that education is important. The problem isn't with allocating money. The money is there. Teachers are still getting paid. The textbooks are still there. The chalkboard is still in the classroom. The problem is the social relation between the community and the teacher is broken such that the teacher can pretty much do whatever they like and suffer no consequences as a result of that. Similar kinds of studies have been done on health workers. and other situations where people are incredibly vulnerable, such as women on the point of childbirth, for example. Right? Doctors extorting them or just simply not being available to even offer routine kinds of service. Same thing can be said about agricultural extension work. Same kinds of arguments can be made about legal assistance. Right? All of those kinds of services, education, health, agriculture, justice, require lots and lots of interaction between a frontline representative of a service provider and an individual or a group. Right? And the service can only be provided through that relationship. Right? If you are a parent in this room and you have a child at school, I guarantee you care far more about the relationship your child has with the teacher than the content of the textbooks that they are learning from. Right? Because you know intuitively that the relationship your child has with the teacher is so central to whether they will enjoy learning, whether they will look forward to going to school every day. Right? That's a social relationship that is fundamental to realizing this objective we call education. Right? These processes of implementation are things that we often neglect. We agree that education is important. We agree to design curriculums. We agree to pay teachers. We agree to provide textbooks and chalk. But we somehow have not figured out how to get the attendance rate of teachers in Bangladesh from an absentee level of 70% down to a level of 30%. Right? The consequences for Bangladesh of getting that number down from 70 to 30 would be enormous in terms of the actual quality and volume of education that Bangladeshi students learned. But we just don't have a way of engaging with those issues in very constructive ways. I would argue because we don't have a good social theoretical component for understanding that particular component of policy implementation. The last sort of social component that I want to talk about is what the Kennedy School Harvard professor Ron Heifetz calls adaptive decision making. And I'll just distinguish very simply between, or make the distinction he does between a technical decision, a problem that requires smart people who can, if you lock them in a room for long enough, will figure out what the answer is. Right? Most mathematical problems are problems of that nature. Right? When we give students problem sets in economics, we are giving them a technical problem. There is an answer, and if you are smart enough, you will figure out what that answer is. There is an answer, you just have to persist hard enough and be smart enough to figure out what that answer is. But adaptive problems are very different kinds of problems. They're problems that don't actually have an answer. They have a range of different answers, and that answer only emerges through a process of dialogue. Okay? Let me give a practical example. When the British and the Irish were trying to solve the peace accord, or the problems of violence in Northern Ireland many years ago, right? There were a number of different options for how that particular problem could be solved. But the actual solution to that problem was only able to be constructed over many years of dialogue and negotiating. And the only answer that had credibility and legitimacy and enforceability was an answer that had emerged through that long, painful process of dialogue and negotiating. Yeah? In international relations, we call it diplomacy. And it's our preferred mode of resolving deep forms of conflict, whether it be in the Middle East or in other parts of the world. But those kinds of problems require social relationships. Right? They require diplomats to have lived in a country long enough to have effective relations not only with their own country, obviously, but with the country in which they live, so they can be an effective ambassador, an effective negotiator. Right? And we see these kinds of problems all the time in development, not just big peace accord types of problems, but much more modest, everyday forms of problem solving around, particularly around judicial and political reform. Right? If your country is coming out of a period of dictatorship, right, you have a problem. How are you going to build a democratic society? Right? Well, that's not a problem set problem. Right? There isn't an answer for that particular problem. And it's not that if we got 10 of the smartest political scientists in the world and gave them $1 billion and 6 months and said, we're locking you in this room, we'll only let you out when you have the answer, right? That's absurd. But not because we don't have enough money or because the people aren't smart enough. Right? The problem is that that type of problem requires an ongoing negotiated political settlement. Now, in legal reform, we face a similar kind of challenge. How to design effective labor laws to protect the human rights of workers. How to design effective contracts to facilitate investment so that people providing money from the outside will have confidence that the piece of land that they have built is in fact theirs and that they can build a property on that. Now, unfortunately, the international development community solves that problem by importing an answer from the outside. We provide a technical solution. We hire lawyers from Yale and Harvard who did very well when they were at Harvard and Yale, but who know nothing about Pakistan or Cambodia. Right? And we bring them in because we think that they are experts in the law. Right? Well, maybe they are experts of one particular kind of law, US law, maybe. Right? But we in development have very weak understandings of how to engage with those kinds of problems that necessarily require very context-specific forms of dialogue and negotiation to craft what becomes, through that process, the new law or the new beginnings of a law. If I had longer, I could give you some examples from Cambodia about how we've engaged in those kinds of problems. But it's not by just bringing in the labor law from Switzerland or from some other country that we think works really well. Right? It's about trying to start with the system that we have and try and negotiate a better set of answers. Because the content and the legitimacy of that reform can only be forged through that process of contestation and dialogue. So, just to summarize where I've tried to get us to this point, right? I'm saying that development is this fourfold transformation. Right? In the social space, it requires us to take on more and varied different types of social roles and to be able to take those on and off, kind of like actors in a theatre. Indeed, if you know your social theory from Goffman and other people, that was exactly the kind of task they saw us doing, is taking on these different masks depending on the kind of role we're in. I am wearing my presentation role now. When I Skype with my wife and kids when I get back to the hotel room, I'm assuming a very different kind of role, and I can make that transition quite seamlessly, as can all of you. Right? But the bigger challenges are not just about negotiating these transitions in our identities and the relations with different sources of political authority. It also has deeply to do with understanding context, understanding process, and understanding these processes of negotiation and dialogue, which are so central to solving many of the key tasks that we face in development. Okay, that's all a prelude to even talking about social capital, right? And I have, as I said, I have the luxury of doing that because you have to understand that this is sort of the broader intellectual context within which I think it makes sense to then start deploying a language, or a terminology rather, of social capital. So then, what does social capital theory have to say about this? You know, I've laid out some sort of general propositions, some general statements of the kinds of problems that we encounter in development. Why would we choose to use social capital theory? Why couldn't we use some other kind of theory? Well, the short answer, I think, is that in the world of policy and decision making, precisely because people like me are such a minority species, we need a set of terms that can help us to bring some of the core themes of social theory to bear into a world where most of the dominant assumptions, most of the language that is used is that of economics. And as we'll see shortly, people have been very critical of that. They have seen this as a capitulation, as a ceding all of this terrain to economics when we should be arguing more forcefully for our own space. I don't particularly buy that, but I don't even want to debate that particular point. I just want to give you about 20 minutes or so on what I think is the core components of social capital theory, then look at how we've tried to operationalize and measure some of these themes. And then I'll talk about this Indonesian case of a practical, real-life manifestation, not just a cute, small project, but a massive $billion-a-year project that embodies explicitly exactly these kinds of principles. Let me get a water and let the translators catch up. Okay, right. So let's just look at some of the core ideas, the intuition that's behind social capital. Social capital, as formally defined, refers to the norms and networks that enable people to share resources and work together. Okay? The norms and networks enabling people to share resources and work together. There's two sort of intuitive aspects of this. One is that we have incredible assets in the friendships that we have. Networking sites like Facebook and then the power of those are testimony to the fact that we spend an awful lot of time worrying about or contributing to types of websites like that. Our own, again, everyday sense is that most of the people you care most about are the people closest to you, are the social relationships that you have. A range of different studies on happiness, for example, have shown that people with more friends and who have a more vibrant social life are vastly happier than people who are richer but have fewer of those kinds of contacts in their life. So it shouldn't be a radical idea, really, to suggest that actually our social connections are important in and of themselves. They're important, what we call intrinsically, right? They matter because they matter. But they also matter instrumentally. They matter because they help us to procure information and resources that enable us to do other things that we couldn't do without them. So in English, I'm sure there is an equivalent sort of maxim in Italian and every other language that I've visited around the world. But in English, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And as I said, there's proverbs from Swahili and Danish. Every country I've spoken at on these things, everybody can come up to me afterwards and say, oh yeah, we've got some variant on that says, these social relationships are just so important for us. And as I said, it shouldn't be controversial to have to make that particular point, I don't think. So at some level, it's a very banal assertion, right? It's stating the obvious, right? But the point is that much of our thinking in development policy and in the rest of public policy more generally often has relegated those kinds of issues to a much lower priority. Now, I won't go into the various different debates that people have around these ideas. There's plenty of articles and debates that have been held forever around those things, and I can come back to some of those. I'm just, for those of you that are fancy yourself as a critic of all of these things. I'm very aware of what those concerns are, and I can address them if we like to later on. The more interesting sort of research issue for me, though, has been how we go about trying to turn general definitions and intuition into more formalized social science. How we measure these things qualitatively and quantitatively, and how we use this to inform public policy debates in general and debates in development in particular. And again, I should stress that this was seen as such a new idea in many respects in development during the 1990s, in large part because for the previous 4 decades up to that point, there had been very little attention at all given to social relationships. Modernization theory, if you studied that as a student, largely saw social relationships as being an obstacle to development, right? Whether it was from the left end of the political spectrum or the right end of the political spectrum. Most of the discussions around social relationships and discussions of developing countries construed these relationships as an obstacle. And I think part of what the social capital agenda was initially trying to do was to say, well, poor people have each other. Most of the ways in which poor people survive in situations of great scarcity is by being able to draw on their friends, on their family members to help them. And that matters. If they didn't have those people, they would be dead. Right? Again, that shouldn't be rocket science, but given the prevailing forms of theory and discourse that influence development policy for much of the first 40 years of development's existence, these issues just weren't able to be considered. The first wave of interest in development around social capital was, of course, pioneered by the great Italian scholar, a student of Italy, I should say, Robert Putnam, and his book in 1993, Making Democracy Work. And the first rush of attempts to try and test out the various hypotheses that Putnam was putting on the table was centered on trying to take existing measures and to adapt them. The most recent work, of course, with the benefit of time and resourcing, has tried to explicitly design survey instruments to test specifically some of these more central ideas that I've been talking about. I will get to them later on. The final thing that I want to spend a bit of time talking about is the different dimensions of social capital, because one of the first things that critics tried to argue was that social capital wasn't just this single dimension, wasn't this just one particular thing. We have general definitions, and we might have general intuitive senses of what social capital referred to, but the reality was, from our own lives and certainly from the lives of most poor people, is that they were engaged in very different kinds of relationships, and different kinds of social structures influenced the kinds of opportunities, the kinds of survival and mobility strategies that they deployed. So the initial distinction that was made, to use the distinctions that make easy sense in English at least, was between bonding and bridging social capital. In a series of papers that I helped to contribute, that I wrote about 10 years ago now, we tried to introduce this notion of a linking social capital, and what the difference is between those I will come to now. Bonding social capital, as it's popularly articulated, simply refers to the connections you have to people who share your similar demographic characteristics. All right? If you are familiar with the sociologist Mark Granovetter's work, he coined this notion of strong ties, the people you have very intense or at least regular and frequent interactions with. the simplest definition, or the simplest exemplar is often given as the number of people you have in your life that you would share a deep personal problem with, right? And the average answer for most people is, anybody want to guess? No, more than one. No, that's about 4 or 5. Most, maybe it's different here in Italy. You're all loners. No, at least in sort of the general, when this question is asked of people around the world, how many people do you have that if you got cancer or you got fired from your job or something that was, you know, causing great emotional trauma to you, would you feel comfortable talking about this with? And as I said, the average is about 5 or 6 or so. So that's sort of just a very parsimonious definition. When in studies that have been done on looking at very poor people, what has also been done is to look at, ask questions about if you needed to borrow money for sending your child to a doctor or paying their school fees, right? How many people could you turn to help you get that kind of money? Small amounts of money, but money that would make a real difference in your life. Okay? So those are the kinds of questions that are asked, these very sort of close relationships that we have. The opposite, or the complement, I should say, to bonding, of course, is bridging, the connections you have to people that are dissimilar to you in some way, some demographic kind of way. If you say that you have at most, say, potentially 10 or a dozen people who are in your bonding social capital network, the other people on your Facebook entry, if you're young enough to indulge in all of that, are probably the people that constitute the rest of your bridging social capital. People that you know as acquaintances, as professional colleagues, perhaps as more distant kind of friends. They're probably, in this day, spread all over the world. They're people that share some kinds of commonality with you, but they're probably likely to be fairly different. And the beauty and the power of networking sites like Facebook is that they can use very complicated mathematical algorithms to actually look at the individuals that sit at very key points in the world's social network structure. So it's going to revolutionize sociological research for precisely that reason, that we now have formal data that we can look at just how the world's social networks are structured. Now, one of the unfortunate characteristics for a lot of poor people is that they often have very weak bridging social capital. The only people they know are those people who live in their village, for example, right? And if you only know or only have access to the information and the resources of people that live in essentially the same circumstances as you do, then from an information and resource point of view, there's lots of redundancy in there. Everybody knows exactly the same thing, right? So studies that have been done on inner city communities in the United States or poor communities in Bangladesh very frequently show that poor people have lots of other people that their friends are almost identical to them in terms of their basic demographic characteristics. They don't know people who work in other parts of town. They don't know people who have other kinds of careers than they do. Even the concept of a career is one of those modern things, right? So when I said at the beginning that modernity was about being able to take on and off these different kinds of roles, right? Again, a characteristic for many poor countries is that people's social identities are very circumscribed. They're very particular, right? And part of diversifying people's social networks, part of building their bridging social capital, is in some sense encouraging and giving people the capacity to engage in a much more diversified set of social networks. Right? And many job training programs I'm sure in Italy, certainly it's true in the UK and in the US and Australia, where I am from, is essentially deploying a social capital type strategy, introducing people to people that do different kinds of work, hopefully to change the aspirations that people have. Now, if you listen to the speeches and read the books of Robert Putnam, pretty much his whole theory, or proto-theory, of social capital boils down to that kind of distinction between these bonding networks and these bridging networks. What I and some other people have been trying to do is to say that one of the other defining features of poor communities is not just this horizontal variety of relationships that people have, but it's also to do with the kinds of relationships they have with people in authority, with police, with judges, with healthcare workers, with teachers. Right? For all those reasons that I spelled out before about just how central social relations are to providing precisely those kinds of services, when this more vertical dimension is missing, poor people either are getting routinely exploited, or their political aspirations are being suppressed, or they're just simply not able to engage with a broader set of formal institutions, such as banking, for example. Right? So this linking dimension is about understanding the connections that poor people have to those in positions of power. And again, when you simply tote up the kind of social connections that poor people have, they'll often have quite a lot of bonding social capital, very modest stocks of bridging social capital, and if they have any linking social capital at all, it's usually of a very perverse or negative kind. Their only relationship with the local police is one of harassment. Their only engagement with the local government officials is one of intimidation. Right? So part of my understanding of the social capital agenda is sort of figuring out, in some sense, how to harness the power, initially, the power of people's social connections, to try and help them to diversify the kinds of social connections that they have. But ultimately, it's about helping people to climb up. It's helping them to actually engage with a broader set of political and economic and social institutions in their society. Let me just use an everyday example from development just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. One of the most famous interventions of development over the last 20 years has been group-based microfinance. Some of you have probably heard of the Grameen Bank, for example. This is Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for his work in this area. Right? Well, how does a group-based credit system work? A system, I should add, that was pioneered here in Italy 150 years ago. I know that because that's what I studied for my PhD. But what does a group-based credit system do? Right? It helps poor borrowers form a savings and credit club with people that they know. These people are in the same village as them. They watch over them every day. They can monitor how hard they work, whether they use the money for the purpose they said they were going to use it for. Right? So that's the first thing they do. Millions of dollars and millions of euros have been able to be harnessed through microcredit systems by tapping into people's bonding social capital. Right? But what do these programs then do? They're trying to encourage and expand people's small businesses. They're trying to encourage people to access broader markets. So they're not just selling their baskets or their goats or whatever else they have produced with this money for their own immediate neighbors. They're trying to sell to the neighbors in the next village. And if they get bigger, the village is 2 miles away, 10 miles away. Right? All the time trying to expand the market in the classic way that Adam Smith would have said. Right? Trying to diversify the market and encourage a division of labor. But I think the crucial third step is to recognize that ultimately what we're trying to do is to connect poor borrowers into the formal financial sector. We don't want them just to stay in a little credit club for their whole life. We want them to have a bank account like everybody in this room has a bank account. None of you are members of a savings club, I should imagine, and you are very thankful you don't have to be a member of a savings club. You like your ATM card. You like being able to fill out a form and get a loan from a bank. Right? There aren't people involved in that process other than a banker who makes a rational decision on the basis, hopefully, of your assets and your projected future earnings. Right? So that's the three-part sort of process that we're trying to do in banking. Right? But you can see similar kinds of analogies, I hope, with respect to education, with respect to health, with respect to justice. All of these sort of processes are about trying to work with the initial stock of resources that people have to then diversify their confidence in their capacity to engage with these more diversified environments, but ultimately to engage with and have real engagement with the formal institutions who are supposed to be providing these things. Now, so that's the elements of this theory. Just to show you, this isn't some sort of obscure little part of academia. It was obscure back in 1988 when less than a dozen people a year were referring to this idea. As of 2 years ago, we were up to 16,000 citations a year on social capital, which makes it pretty much as popular as a very mainstream issue like political parties. Right? So it's a phenomenal growth of a field over the last 20 years. It pretty much corresponds to my professional lifetime. So it's it's an issue that's been that a lot of people and a lot of different countries have obviously engaged in. I wouldn't be here if you, as a group, didn't find this subject interesting. And I've been invited to probably 50 different countries around the world to speak on these types of issues. Right? So a lot of people in a lot of places working on very different issues all find something intuitively appealing about the essence of what this literature is trying to bring to the fore. So that's the basic sort of core aspects of the theory. Right? If I call that sort of Social Capital 101. It's sort of what most people, I think, more or less agree on. But to link it back to what I said at the start about these questions of transitions and the changes and the modernization process and how it plays out in these different dimensions, I think we need to challenge this theory a bit more and ask it to try and explain a little more helpfully some of these issues. Now, I think from the first thing we can do is to ask it to look at these questions pertaining to transitions and conflict. As I articulated before, change is always accompanied by conflict, which sometimes becomes violent. So if we're talking about transformations in people's social relationships, social capital theory must help us to engage more constructively with these kinds of sources of contention and hopefully help us to manage these in more peaceful ways. Let's just focus more specifically, though, on the transitions that are centered around these networks, around this bonding, bridging, and linking social capital. I've talked a bit about some of the identity transformations, but a lot of those identity transformations occur at the point at which people start to leave and enter different kinds of social networks. So let's just use a simple diagram here to talk about some stylized facts about what we know about networks and these transitions between different kinds of networks. If one looks at the point A on this graph here, we see people that have very little bonding, bridging, and linking social capital, and correspondingly, usually very low levels of income or welfare more generally. Okay? Part of what we also know from studies of immigrant communities, this is true of studies of immigrants that come to the United States, I would wager very heavily that it is true of immigrants that came here to Italy as well, is that one of the things that immigrants do is to move into areas where there are lots of people like them, people that have similar kinds of social networks and social backgrounds to them. So by moving into an area where there is lots of other people like you are able to get credit, social support, knowledge about getting your kids into schools, all those things that are really important when you arrive in a new country, especially a country where perhaps you don't even speak the local language. Okay? And the Chinese are infamous for this. That's why we have Chinatowns in so many different countries around the world, is that very specific in terms of where these people live. But research on these same communities shows that it's not simply the case that more of these networks is better. These networks can also make very powerful claims on you. If you live in this community long enough, sooner or later, another wave of immigrants is going to come along and make claims on you in exactly the same way that you made claims on people before you. Right? So in some very rich qualitative studies that have been done on transitions in and out of these ethnic communities, what some people have noticed is that after a certain point of time, when people feel that their language is good enough, and when they have adequate resources to support themselves, the most ambitious of these people initially leave the network completely. In the most radical instances, they will even change their name so that they're not even able to be identified in a telephone book as a member of a particular community. So in some sense, they will sort of further, by living in a place long enough and getting more and more networks, actually their welfare goes down. Okay? And what they then do, as I said, is make this big, quite radical transition to put themselves into a different kind of network. All right? So these are two different sets of networks, but the big transition that people make is this transition from C to D, from the high end of one social network to starting all over again at a new network. All right? So they will move out of Chinatown in San Francisco and move to New York or to Denver to start that process all over again. But believing that by accessing these new networks, they will be entering a place that has even more diversified and richer resources for them to tap into. Now, this is not just an immigrant story. It's what you did when you graduated from high school and went to university. It's what I did when I left home and went to university. Right? I'd stayed in the one town long enough. I realized that if I was going to get ahead in the world, I would have to get not just a more education, I would have to put myself into an entirely different social space called the university. In my case, it then also meant graduate education, which was not just leaving home to go to university, it meant leaving Australia to go to the United States. Right? So we've all gone through quite seismic transitions like that. Right? When you get married, if you were in that category, you also made a transition like that. You said goodbye to one set of, not so much goodbye, but you said, I'm leaving formally one set of social networks. My primary allegiance now will be to this new network. And that's what getting married in some sense is about. Right? So play that cycle out over a long enough period of time, and you see, first of all, very non-linear transitions in our social relationships, often very traumatic and difficult transitions from one set of networks to another as part of, even as an instrumental quest for improving our welfare and the opportunities that we have available to us. So this is not just an immigrant story, it's our story. It happens that we are part of societies that have institutions underpinning them to make sure that we don't completely fall through the cracks. But part of living in a modern society is that it facilitates those kinds of transitions with a whole bunch of counselors and a whole bunch of other people there to help us do that. All right? And again, a defining characteristic of many developing countries is that the risks to taking that transition between C and D are so high, the benefits simply don't weigh the costs. Or, more particularly, from a social psychological point of view, you're not even aware of the opportunities that might be available to you by making that kind of transition. In research that we did on social capital in Guatemala nearly a decade ago, for example, interviewing people, poor people working on coffee plantations, on fincas. And we asked the children of the coffee growers, what do you want to be when you grow up? What is your ambition in life? And their answer is, I want to work on a coffee plantation. Even though they saw their parents scratching by for a living very lives in servitude to horrible bosses that run these plantations, they can't even conceive of a different kind of life for themselves. And that's a very difficult mindset to try and change, is when in those kinds of circumstances. But the social capital lens sort of provides, in some sense, one explanation for why people would choose to stay in one particular social network, even when the gains potentially to moving into a different network would vastly outweigh that. Okay, let me just move through a few other things here, which I've already spoken about those things. Let me talk about the measurement aspects, because I think I've done enough on the theory. The challenge that we at the World Bank faced, having sort of sorted out sort of the general theory of what we were trying to talk about here, was to try and design instruments for assessing social capital. The largest survey that the World Bank uses to assess poverty in the world is the Living Standards Measurement Survey, the LSMS, as it's called. And precisely because that survey is used in so many different countries, there is a lot of lobbying that goes on to try and get your issue to piggyback on that survey, because if you can get it into that survey, then you can look at the effect of your particular issue, whatever it may be, on a whole bunch of income and other economic variables. So one of the challenges that a group of us at the bank set ourselves was to try and take the first generation of survey attempts to try and get at social capital issues and provide a synthesis and a critical review of all these different surveys to come up with something that we thought was represented the best lessons from all of these different attempts to ask questions about 6 different things: group membership, trust and solidarity, collective action, information communication, inclusion and exclusion, and then empowerment and political action. Now that survey tool is available for free on the web. You can download it very easily. But others have also done work, so I don't want to imply that we've done the only stuff on this. A whole bunch of people have tried to do this. What I think characterized ours was not just that we did this internally, is that we brought 15 heads of international 15 people from different countries who are responsible for running big surveys in their country to Washington to sort of provide a critical feedback on this process. So we're pretty confident that the way in which this survey is structured passes at least the quality test that these experts would provide. One of the other ways in which you may have encountered the social capital literature is through these more macro level variables. Certainly some of the initial work that Francis Fukuyama and then Steve Knack and Phil Kiefer and other people tried to do was to put some sort of national level measures of social capital into big cross-country studies of economic growth, for example. That work was initially sort of fairly popular in the sense that it attracted a lot of attention. If you've been following closely the kinds of definitions, the kind of examples, and the kinds of theories that I've been articulating here, it's been largely at this very micro level. And my personal view is that that's where we should keep it. There may be in aggregate something like a social capital index that you can construct for countries, but I think that's very problematic. I don't want to get into the business of saying that Italy has more or less social capital than Norway or Australia. I think that's an easy game to play because it makes you famous, but I don't think that's particularly sensible, precisely because all of the action that I'm interested in is at the local level, and that itself is incredibly varied. Remember, I said before that I think understanding social context is crucial, and I'm sure Putnam's study here in Italy showed that, of course, the big differences between North and South. You can see differences between the North and differences between the South. In Indonesia, where I've worked, the standard deviation on any of these kind of things is way more interesting to me than the average. And explaining the standard deviation, I think, is actually much more relevant for policy questions than trying to come up with some national level strategy for improving social capital in your country or something like that. I just don't think that's right. Okay, but precisely because context is crucial, what we've also tried to do is provide a qualitative complementary tool for engaging with these issues. And I worked with 2 anthropologists and with one of my other colleagues at the bank. We used these same 6 dimensions, but we provided a set of qualitative tools for assessing these things. That is also available freely online. In the most recent incarnation of this, we've tried to provide a synthesis document that sort of brings these qualitative and quantitative dimensions together. So if you look at the Handbook of Social Capital, which came out last year, or the just published Handbook of Measurement, which has a whole bunch of interesting chapters on measuring variables of all different shapes and sizes. Veronica and I sort of made an attempt to try and bring together these 2 tools that we'd worked on before as a synthesis statement. Now, again, when we've written this up, we call this the second word on the subject, certainly not the last word. Right? Second in the sense that we're trying to provide a clearinghouse of sensible, thoughtful questions that have been asked on these issues. If you take these to Mozambique or to Chad or to Peru or anywhere else in the world, we would be horrified if all you do is sort of just cut and paste these questions into some big survey module, run around villages and stick a clipboard under someone's nose and ask them, how many people they can trust or something like that. All the value added of this work is engaging with these social relations in the contexts in which they occur. And these tools that we have provided hopefully just mean that you don't have to start from scratch or start from the very beginning if you want to do this kind of work. And if your engagement with these issues finds that the instruments are worthless, please write and tell us. We're not in the business of trying to promulgate this. We're in the business of trying to improve them and work with the whole range of different people around the world trying to engage on these issues. Okay, in the final bit, I want to talk about this project in Indonesia that I've studied for the last 12 years or so, largely because it is the living incarnation of everything I've been speaking to you for the last hour and 20 minutes or so. Right? This particular project is called the Kecamatan Development Program. Kecamatan is the Indonesian word for sub-district. Right? So it's the primary unit of analysis at which it works is the sub-district. But here on in, I'll just use the acronym KDP because it's just easier. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what it does. I'll describe the details of it shortly. This particular project has also now been replicated of sorts in several other countries: East Timor, Cambodia, Afghanistan. But I should stress that what has not been done is just to, again, cut and paste the contents of this program and transfer it from one context to another. What we've tried to stress in all of the work that we have done on this has been the process that produced KDP. If you can replicate the process that produced KDP, then maybe you've got a chance of producing a project that's as effective as KDP. Where does KDP come from? Well, it's a product of a series of country studies launched in the mid-1990s to try and explicitly test out the Putnam thesis. And this particular series of studies was called the Local Level Institutions Studies, the LLI. And the LLI was conducted in about 6 or 7 different countries around the world, one of which was Indonesia, and essentially entailed doing 2 years of anthropological level fieldwork to understand exactly, or as precisely as possible, what the local level governance structures in Indonesia looked like. Right? This was the mid-1990s. They had no knowledge, of course, that this big seismic change was just going to come down the road. They got lucky, as we'll hear shortly. All right? But what then did happen, of course, was that the East Asia financial crisis came along in 1997 and 1998, and almost overnight got rid of a dictator and his cronies and the government apparatus that they had run for the best part of 30 or more years in Indonesia. So this created a crisis for subsequent governments because they had to obviously do something that was different from what the dictator governments had done before. It was also a crisis for the World Bank. It was a crisis for the World Bank because the World Bank had explicitly been on record as saying how fabulous the Suharto government was. All right? And when that government was exposed, like the Wizard of Oz, to have been producing economic growth that wasn't, and to be producing wholesale suppression of people's human rights and all the rest of it, if the World Bank was going to stay in business in Indonesia, it had to be lending money, but it had to be lending money in ways that were very different to the ways that it had been lending money in the past. So you had 2 crises. A crisis for the succession of governments that came along after the fall of Suharto, and you had a crisis for the world's biggest lending agency that had to be seen to be doing something very different to what it had been doing so proudly with the bad guys only 3 or 4 years before that. Along comes the team that has been doing in obscurity this local level institution study. And they say, you know what, we think we actually understand something about what's going on outside of Jakarta. We've spent the last 2 years traveling around all of the different rural areas of this country. We think we can design a type of intervention that is consistent with local Indonesian cultures, but that can lend, hopefully, lots of money, but that can also, more importantly, help to build the beginnings of a democratic local government in Indonesia. Right? Now, recall that the local level institution study had been undertaken during the Suharto period. It had been undertaken with Suharto's blessing. He had wanted it because he wanted to try and bypass one layer of government officials that he thought was being insufficiently loyal to him. So this was a project initially designed to help a dictator. That's the untold story of this particular project, which we otherwise now celebrate as this paragon of pro-democracy, accountability, and inclusion. Right? But the beauty of this project was that it was able to change very quickly from being a project that was at least nominally going to help to get resources more quickly to the local level, to being one that could now do this, but in ways that actually truly empowered people from the bottom to be able to have a voice and a say in how those resources were going to be allocated. So in a very quick period, you had not just a new period of democracy, you had a whole transition in the Indonesian economy from an autocratic capitalist society to a more open one. And then as part of this reform process, a very explicit attempt to try and decentralize, to try and get away from everything being run from Jakarta to things being run in a much more regional and sub-regional and local level. So some people sort of called this the triple transition that Indonesia was going through. Now I mention that because if you go back to the little wheel, little circle of modernization that I had before, you pretty much had three of those four and almost the fourth transition occurring simultaneously, right? A transition in the economy from one that was just making boatloads of money selling off its logs and its oil, right, to building a truly modern economy. That had to be negotiated. Transitions in the polity from people that had lived their whole life under a ruthless autocratic dictatorship in which resistance was not even futile. You were executed or imprisoned for even the most minor dissent against the government. So that had to be, that transition had to be negotiated. You had a transition in the administration because this had been, the power of the Suharto government was such that from Jakarta, they could control everything across this country, right? With very modest forms of training, nonetheless, they were able to produce a ruthlessly efficient administrative apparatus. Right? Well, now that apparatus, I should stress, was built on party loyalty. Right? You were not hired according to your competence. You were hired according to how faithfully you could uphold and entrench that autocratic government. Right? So a transition now into a more modern administrative apparatus, which does what a modern administrative apparatus is supposed to do, which is to have a meritocratic form of hiring, to respond to feedback from users, not just provide a one-way flow of information from the top down. All right? And finally, now your transformations in the social space as well. Transitions from people just being seen as almost exclusively as citizens, now to being seen as members of any of the 350 different language and ethnic groups that comprise Indonesia. All right? So each of those different groups suddenly had a moment to express their grievances, which had been pent up and suppressed by 40 years of dictatorship. Right? So this is why you get the civil war in Aceh, which had been going on for a long time, but which got even worse after that particular period. If you are, just as a footnote, if you are familiar with Benedict Anderson and his work on imagined communities, well, you will know that book, famous book, was written on the basis of Indonesia, and Indonesia was the quintessential imagined community. It is a political fiction that 200 million people reside in this country we call Indonesia. Right? The language is artificial. The language Bahasa is only 70 years old. It was invented to support nationalism. Right? So the withering away of that whole system overnight would have suggested that this country, which wasn't ever really a country except by political dictatorship, was just going to be rife for conflict. So into all of that, can you design development projects that can help manage these transitions, right? Because that was the issue. That was if this country was not going to explode into secession and a civil war, something had to be done to reimagine and modernize the economy, the polity, the administrative structure, and the society. We need to have a darker room. This is just what KDP looks like, a series of village-level meetings, the details of which I'll get into shortly. The point I simply want you to note from this photograph is the number of women in attendance and where they are sitting, which is all around the front here, which was, again, unprecedented in this particular part of Indonesia, in South Sulawesi. But just the fact that these people are engaged in a public deliberation at all was itself a first for the country. Let me just go through the details of what this project actually is. It was initially rolled out in about 28,000 villages across the country, which sounds a lot, but it's nothing compared to what it is now. And it basically is a project that devolves resources to communities and then essentially holds a competition at the village level where villagers themselves decide who gets what. So you don't have experts coming in and saying, our assessment says you need a road and our assessment says you need a health clinic. You have a competition, just in the same way that you applied for entry into university, in the same way that academics apply for research grants, right? You make your case. You say, here's a pot of money that's available, and I think my research program is good enough. And if a group of your peers says, yes, it's good enough, you get the money, right? Essentially, exactly that same procedure was followed, except with poor, illiterate villagers. And saying, you guys probably know where the problems are in your life way better than anybody else. So what we're going to do is put money on the table. You have several months to organize yourselves into groups of people to propose a particular project that you would like to have funded out of this particular pot of money. We can't hold the meeting until at least 30% of the projects that are being considered have been submitted by women's groups. So until we have enough women being involved in this process, we just don't hold a contest at all. So there's an affirmative action component, if you will, built into this. Right? There was additional resourcing available if people needed some technical assistance. For example, if they said, well, what we really need is a bridge to connect go across this ravine. Building a bridge probably requires some engineering knowledge, right? But that knowledge is expensive. So they could apply to the project to have an engineer work with them to cost out and design this small little bridge, right? But at the end of the day, when the moment came for the meeting to be held to allocate the money, the criteria that everybody had to uphold was how many people is this likely to help, how cost effective is it likely to be, and how many people will benefit from it. Right? So an efficiency argument and a sustainability argument and an implementation argument. And it would be held in a room not unlike this, and every group would have 10 minutes, essentially, to make their case, to make their pitch for why their project should be funded, why this is the problem that we need to solve. Right? Now, you can see through that process that conflict is being created, right? Because some people are going to spend a lot of time preparing a project, and just like a research grant for academics, and they will lose. They will not get money, right? So in addition to all this background of transition that I was talking about before, now you're actually creating conflict by creating a competition where there are real winners and real losers that are created as a result of this. So here, the socialization process was key, helping people to deeply understand the rules of the game as this was being played out. Right? And the challenge that was put to me as a researcher here, all right, was has not so much the economic impacts, right? Is this a better way to deliver money to poor people? The more ambitious goal of this project was to say, can we actually help people through this competitive process acquire the skills of civic and political action? Can we encourage them to stand up, probably for the first time ever in their life, in front of their peers, especially if they are the very poorest and most marginalized members of their community? Can we encourage them to be able to confidently and competently articulate their aspirations and their arguments for why the money should be spent in this way? So these are very classic civic skills, being able to defend an argument, being able to provide a reasoned explanation for why resources public resources should be spent in a particular way rather than another. And so the challenge that our research team faced was, does this actually happen? When people participate in this kind of process, does it help them to acquire these civic skills of deliberation and negotiation? And the short answer was, well, it depends. But for the most part, when these projects were well implemented, yes, it did. And if I had another hour, I would roll out the whole methodology for how we addressed all of the very complicated methodological problems associated with doing this. But it was a very intriguing challenge to look at this particular way of changing the political space within Indonesian society at the local level. I should also stress that this was not just a competition that was held and then everybody walked away. The results of these decisions were then posted on a bulletin board that was posted in the middle of the community, the town square, if you will, the piazza. Right? So everybody knew who had won and why they had won. Local journalists were allowed to attend all of these meetings. They were open meetings. They were not closed to a few people. They were open meetings. And if journalists identified problems, they were free to write those up in the local newspaper. So this was an instance of where transparency, which is another one of these words that we use in development a lot of the time, actually was done. Right? We know what the rules are, and we know what the competition is about. When the competition is held, here is what the outcomes were, and here is how and why those outcomes were reached. Now that may sound in this room kind of a little bit boring. That was a radical, unprecedented innovation in Indonesian society. No one had ever consulted poor people on what they wanted to have before. No one had ever told them how a decision had been made. People just assumed in the past that the decision had been made because the local village chief had wanted it to be that way. So when resources were provided for the community, but they ended up being spent building him a new house or paving the road past his house, people just assumed that was the way things were done. Here, now, you have a chance for genuine transparency to be upheld. The other word we often use in development is accountability. Right? We wanted to have feedback built into all of this. And I was arguing before that in the case of India and Bangladesh, where teachers don't show up for work, that there is no accountability at the local level. The big innovation for this project was also to try and ensure that when corruption was identified, when problems did occur, that there were opportunities for immediate redress. So in one celebrated instance, a village chief took all of the KDP money and bought himself a nice new speedboat, which promptly landed him in jail. Again, unprecedented in Indonesian society for a local official to be humiliated, essentially, and thrown in jail for violating a basic rule of a development project. Right? The other innovation on accountability was having a complaints facility available in every village at which this project was conducted. And so the idea is that when problems occurred, as they inevitably did with a project that requires lots of this adaptive decision making that I mentioned before, right? When those problems occurred, there was an immediate person and a place where people could go to register their complaints. And so part of our research was looking at other development projects in Indonesia that didn't have these kinds of transparency and accountability mechanisms. And the major finding from our study was that there was, in all of this competition, in all of this cauldron of transition, in all of our work with $1 million worth of research, we could only find one instance of violence that had occurred through KDP, and yet 36 episodes of conflict through a whole range of other different development projects, which were going on simultaneously. So these projects were, this particular mechanism produced lots of conflict, but it didn't produce violence. And that was the key thing that we were trying to understand. Given how much what we knew about these conflicts and these transitions and how much this was likely to occur in Indonesia, having a development project that was able to anticipate that conflict and respond to it early before it got out of control was very important. It's like putting fire alarm systems into a development project, all right? Having an early warning system so that the whole building doesn't burn down. If you can quickly identify a fire when it breaks out, you can have a sprinkler system that descends on people and it puts out the fire, right? These kinds of development projects were producing lots and lots of little conflicts, but none that ever grew and became a big conflict. The only conflict that we did observe was actually a good conflict in the sense that it happened when a villager tried to report a corrupt local official who was using KDP money in the wrong way, and the village official sent his mafia boys around to toughen him up and seriously injured him, actually. But one could argue that that, in some sense, was a positive instance of conflict in the sense that people had the confidence now that they could report instances of corruption and that they were now in a position to be able to hold public officials accountable for their actions. So I've sort of explained some of the results, and I can, as I said, it's a longer conversation, but I just want to conclude with the 3 points here. The first is that I think social capital should be part of and not a substitute for our thinking about development. It's not a grand theory for how we should solve poverty problems in the world. Nobody knows how to do that, and we will never know how to do that. If somebody did, we would have found them already. But this kind of way of thinking about these issues, I think, can help us to engage in processes of transition, in contexts undergoing these transitions to modernization in much more constructive ways than we have in the past. Particularly, I think this language of social capital can help us to focus on these negotiated problems, the problems that require interaction. And the fact that this language of social capital can help us to, as academics in a nice university like Trento, to have conversations like this is the first and most visible step now of those kinds of conversations. But the fact that you can see this occurring in so many different countries, in so many different sectors around the world, is testimony, I think, to the importance of having conversations about these issues. Because there, as I said, there isn't an answer. There is not a problem set type solution awaiting these answers, these questions. There is only negotiated solutions to these kinds of problems, and we need a language that facilitates those kinds of conversations. The related point comes, I have here an extended quote from the great Albert Hirschman, and I'll read it out because I think it's one of my favorite quotes in this business. He says that we should treat human beings as something fairly precious and not just something that you can play upon. You see, if you ever could figure everything out, if you ever could have a social science that really is a science, then we would be the first ones to be disappointed. We would be dismayed, because if people become like that, we can be figured out. And that means that we're not worth as much as we think. Were we ever to succeed, then actually we would have failed. So, as much as it's important to have clear definitions, coherent theory, nice measurements, and valid measurements, and nice operational instruments that follow on the basis of that, that's what we as social scientists want. That's what we're paid to try and do. But this isn't science, this is social science. And much of the tyranny of the 20th century was born out of people who thought that they could manage their societies. And you in this country know that as well as anybody. And development has a very strong tendency to want to do that kind of level of social engineering. And the more we create big targets for ourselves, in some sense like the Millennium Development Goals or other things that push us very, very powerfully to move countries in particular ways at particular speeds, the stronger the imperative it creates for finding and replicating tools that will help us to do that. And I think we need to heed Albert Hirschman's warning at that particular point that this isn't a quest for a tool that will enable us to tweak social relationships one way or another. And the fact that our theory is not that precise and our measurement is not that precise and our tools for responding to it are not that precise is absolutely fine. That's probably as it should be. That's not an excuse for being sloppy or for being lazy. It just means the quest here is not for manipulation and perfection in the same way that we can tweak interest rates, for example, by 1/4 of a point and watch the whole economy turn, right? We have macroeconomic envy, those of us that are sociologists and anthropologists, because if you're a macroeconomist, you have tools that you can tweak a little bit and you can watch the whole world rotate around your decision to switch interest rates from 3.5 to 3.75. Right? We crave that kind of power. Or maybe we don't. Right? The point is that a lot of these issues are just very deeply context specific. Messing with them is something we do at our peril, and most of the modern history, or even ancient history, of trying to engage with these issues is only one of messing things up and making them worse. All of which is to say, in some sense, that to quote a philosopher from over 50 years ago now, who coined this wonderful phrase that a lot of terms that we use in social science are essentially contested concepts. Right? In English, at least, words like culture, institutions, rule of law, transparency, accountability, blah, 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 blah. All right? These are words that are important. They refer to things that are very powerful in the lives of people, but they are essentially contested. They will always remain essentially contested. And it's not because we're not smart enough or haven't spent enough money on them that we haven't figured out what a more precise version of them is. Right? They are essentially contested concepts, and they will always remain that. So in the most recent writing that I have done on this, in an article that's forthcoming in the Annual Review of Political Science, I essentially make that argument that there's so much heat being generated, and the amount of criticism that I have to deal with for sort of going with and using this language of social capital ultimately is best addressed, I think, by seeing it as an essentially contested concept. It means that when we are engaging with diverse audiences in diverse different contexts, we need a language that will provide some way of having a common conversation, as we are doing right now, across a linguistic and cultural barrier. But the same applies when anyone else goes to Indonesia, to Cambodia, to Mozambique, or anyone else. To have a conversation, you need a language or some terms, even the very basic ones and imperfect ones, that make that conversation possible. So the dual task, having now reached 16,000 citations per year, is to recognize the limits of what that can do, and saying in very specialized circumstances, when we're talking with particular people, in particular disciplines, in particular countries, we have actually in our social science toolkits terms that are potentially more precise and more powerful for engaging with these issues. Let me just use one example from sociology. Sociologists have a wonderful term for talking about networks within organizations, such as the University of Trento, for example. And this concept that a sociologist called Ronald Burt has coined is called a structural whole. And it means that when you look at the networks within an organization, right, there are certain clusters of people around which knowledge congregates. And the task of entrepreneurs is to connect these different bodies of knowledge. Right? Now, he has published 15 articles in the most prestigious sociology journals, all around this concept of structural wholes, right? But most of you are looking kind of bamboozled on that, and sociologists understand perfectly what that is, but for everybody else, it's kind of a mystery. But when you read Ronald Burt's popular writings, he turns all of that into a language of social capital. So his otherwise very precise, very neat, very carefully measured work in prestigious academic journals, when it translates to the rest of the world, he uses the language of social capital. And I've given you my version of how we can use the language of social capital to understand these processes of change and transition, of survival and mobility, of engagements between formal and informal institutions, and these broader shifts towards modernization. But that's ultimately the big value for social capital, it seems to me, is that it makes these conversations possible. And to the extent that it helps us now have that kind of conversation, then it's done its job. Thanks very much.